Um, Before we start, I was told by a few birds that it is your birthday as well.
It is
So,
indeed.
so happy birthday.
Thanks very much. St. Patrick's Day as well.
I know. Do you have any Irish in your family?
No, not knowingly, no, but I do.
Not knowing.
I feel an affinity because of my birthday.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Fantastic. Just do me a favor, so knock if you can knock your volume up a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I can move it closer to my mouth.
Yeah, that's okay. That's brilliant. Okay, so okay, well, we're on the Lord Be With You podcast show, and I've got a special guest today, a good friend Luke Sewell, and we're going to talk about Tolkien and mythology today. Um, it's a bit of a treat for the podcast world and for the viewers of the show, who I really appreciate. And we have brushed a little bit on talking about sort of Lord of the Rings, but there was always a plan to kind of go into more depth about the world of Tolkien and his literary works, and even the media that comes from Lord of the Rings, including the movies as well. Um, so this is really exciting and a direction we wanted to go. And Luke, I've kind of begged and harassed Luke to be involved on the show. Okay, so first of all, I want to really ask you, what got you into Tolkien and and where did you first encounter his stories?
So I encountered Tolkien. My dad, who really liked his books and read them to me as a child. I can really distinctly remember his copy of the Hobbit was a burgundy hardback that he read to me as a child. It's probably one of the earliest stories that I can remember him reading me, to be honest, alongside the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis.
Oh wow, yeah.
And obviously, next to the Hobbit on the bookshelf was this big, thick, single volume version of a book called The Lord of the Rings, which
Oh wow.
after finishing The Hobbit, my dad, I think I always referred to that as, when we'll get to a point when we're ready, we can read that, because it follows on. It's a sort of sequel in lots of ways. But in 2001, 20 years ago, the Peter Jackson films were released. I was 8 years old, and this was the sort of hurry up that my dad needed. Like, we needed to read this book before we were going to go and watch the films in the
Yeah.
cinema. So yeah, he read me the whole thing. We did sort of little not chapters, but so we do a little bit every night, and he'd do the voices and all of that sort of thing. And then we went and watched the films after we'd finished it, which is some of my happiest memories, I think. And I've continued to love those stories ever since. But it began with The Hobbit.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a fantastic story. So we'll go more into the films later, but just a quick snapshot, like sort of a question. Did the films match up to your expectations after obviously reading the books with your dad?
Um, yes and no in lots of ways. They can be quite difficult to separate for me, because
Yeah,
we read that book so we could go and watch them in the cinema, and so I was able to form an imagination sort of independently of
yeah,
what's presented in the films. But we've watched the films a lot since, and so it's very difficult to
yeah,
sometimes separate those, especially visually. And I think imagining the geography sometimes,
yeah,
the films did a really good job of that. But there's different places where they don't match up. I think a lot of Lord of the Rings fans would point to Faramir in particular as a character that really doesn't match up with
yeah,
the book. Aragorn to a lesser extent. And for me, the two hobbits, Merry and Pippin, I have a very sort of distinct imagination of what they were like, which doesn't quite
yeah,
match up with the film, but that's okay. They're sort of
yeah.
separate things.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, so moving on. We've mentioned Tolkien before on this show, like, briefly, sort of thing. But tell me, like, from your point of view, Luke, and obviously you really invest a lot in Lord of the Rings. not just the books, but even the whole culture of Middle Earth and the whole mythology there. Who was Tolkien?
Yeah, so I'd probably be among sort of that group of people that I wouldn't be sort of an academic when it comes to Tolkien, but I'd probably be, you know, a more invested fan.
Yeah,
So yeah, I don't know everything there is about him, but he was born in 1892, so sort of around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century.
yeah.
Served in the First World War and fought in the
Mm,
Battle of the Somme. But he wasn't primarily an author. At least I don't think he'd have seen himself that way. He was far
yeah.
more interested in poetry, particularly Old English poetry, like Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas and that sort of thing.
Mm,
And his job was as a professor of philology. So he studied ancient languages, Old English, Anglo-Saxon, that sort of thing. And he actually only wrote two full proper novels in his lifetime, which the ones
wow.
we talked about, the Hobbit in 1937, which is essentially a children's book that he wrote for his children,
Yeah.
and then The Lord of the Rings, which came a bit later in 1954. And his son Christopher, who was the first person that The Hobbit was really read to, has continued to publish a lot of his father's work posthumously. So the most famous of those would be The Silmarillion, which is
Mm,
a sort of mythic history for the world that The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit takes place in. But he's also published a lot of other stuff, including a lot of his father's letters and notes, explaining sort of some of the creation of those worlds. And Christopher, sadly, he only died last year, but he was of
oh
ripe old
wow.
age. I think he was in his 90s. So yeah, it was about a year
Wow.
ago, I think.
Fantastic. Yeah, I've heard some little bits about Christopher and like how he's really looked after his father's legacy, and it's amazing to have that a lot. You know, there's so many interesting books even after Tolkien died that uh, came out showing the materials. I think there's some Arthurian legends as well that came through, and even like you mentioned Beowulf, because I know that Tolkien, you know, they didn't realize that he'd done a copy of Beowulf and translated it himself, and that's fascinating as well. So it's interesting sort of thing, and obviously Silmarillion. I don't know if a lot of the podcast listeners would know much of the Silmarillion because it hasn't been made into a film, as far as I know, um, and it is a very interesting take of the whole of Middle Earth history, going back to Eru Ilúvatar, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really fascinating idea and a sort of creation myth, which kind of, in a way, kind of parallels the Book of Genesis from the Bible. Absolutely fascinating. Um, so, thinking about these things, what do you think? Why do you think Tolkien was so special, and why his work was so popular?
That's a fantastic question. His two books, the two that he did write in his lifetime, are really, really good. I mean, the Silmarillion's fantastic as well, but those two in particular have become incredibly popular and are probably more widely read now than they've ever been. Neither The Hobbit nor The Lord of the Rings, I think, have ever been out of print since their original publication. And that's been helped by the fact that some very popular films have been made about them recently.
Yeah,
But in terms of what makes the work so special, it's hard to believe now, given how established the genre is. But Tolkien's work represented one of the first, and I think still one of the best examples of fantasy writing, and of this idea of speculative fiction that takes place entirely within a creative world, a created world that has its own history, its own culture.
yeah,
For Tolkien, a really important part of that is that there's his own created languages are in there, and that's something that's often referred to now as mythopoesis. So the
yeah.
creation of sort of a sub myth and that sort of thing. That's still really unique today. We might not think of it that way, but Off the top of your head, if you could try and name any pieces of fiction, either films or books, that take place entirely within a completely imaginary universe, can you think of any?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think for me as a big Star Wars geek, I think like I think that would be the sort of the most sort of as a franchise and as an expanded universe, that would be the one that is the most obvious, I think.
Yeah, I think Star Wars is probably the most culturally significant. You could debate. There's that bit at the start of Star Wars films, isn't it, where it says a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So in
Yeah,
a really tenuous way, you could say they take place in our universe. But it's Star Wars is probably the only other well-known one. You can make an
yeah.
argument for George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones recently has
Oh, modern,
gained some
yeah,
popularity. That would be a good example.
yeah,
Some of Ursula Gwyn's writings, but there's not a whole lot. If you were to think of even Marvel or Harry Potter, most of those stories take place nominally within our own reality and sort of expand a little
yeah,
bit on it. And there's
yeah.
also
That's it.
writing that would suggest that Middle Earth isn't too different from that. That Tolkien is trying to create a kind of mythology for either Britain or for Western Europe, but only nominally. I think, yeah, we've seen how sort of relatively rare what he decided to do was, and even more so at the time that he decided to do it. And the reason for his work being so good is, I think, because of the richness and the sense of reality that he's able to give to the world that he creates. It has a depth and a detail and a consistency, and it feels real, which is something that I think develops out of the way Tolkien develops languages, cultures, all of this really minute detail, the way he's able to reuse much older pagan mythology that he liked,
Yeah,
and how, yeah, most of the stories he created to provide a context for his Elvish languages that he was always inventing and rewriting and creating alphabets for, and that sort of thing. That's something that I think sort of Star Wars does well in a different way. That was sort of one of the first science fiction films that felt sort of gritty and lived in, the way things materially look in those original Star
yeah.
Wars films. Like it's grimy and
I
yeah,
do.
it
I
feels
do
old.
really. No, I do. I do. I think I picked up on that theme in an earlier podcast talking about Star Wars. How the Resistance fighters, their ships are worn out, and their ships look old and their gear looks old, and it was a nice kind of a kind of counterbalance to the Empire, whose ships are shiny and new and corporate.
Yeah,
So you really do feel that the Resistance fighters are a ragtag bunch, it's in some ways cobbled together, really fighting for their lives and fighting for the survival of the Resistance, and also, you do empathize with them. You really want them to win because you do feel that they are the underdog in the fight, um, compared to the gleaming corporate shiny empire. Um, so yeah, you do really see kind of Star Wars in that way, and obviously sort of this world building thing that Lord of the Rings and Tolkien really show that it can be done, but you have to really put some effort to try and make this world authentic, so that as fans we can really buy into that narrative. So that's absolutely brilliant. So
that's absolutely it. Yeah, and I think that's what we learned from the fact that those were the only two books he wrote. Like this was his life's work, and he created effectively three pieces of writing out of it in his entire life.
yeah,
But that work isn't wasted, even though the Silmarillion doesn't come out until after Tolkien dies. He'd already started writing it. All of that stuff was in his head when he's writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and you can feel it because the weight of that myth and some of that creation story that you talked about, and the history of his world is in that writing, even if it's not obvious.
Now, we are coming to the end of the first segment, Luke, but we'll have to say for you podcast listeners and those, really following the show that I will beg and harass Luke again to really, and we'll do it on a different episode, but we really will go into more detail about the Silmarillion, especially the creation myth in there, because it is absolutely fantastic. Um, and if any of you are follow the Bible and have looked into the book of Genesis, you will see a lot of parallels between some of the ideas and concepts that are in the Silmarillion to the book of Genesis in the Bible, and even in other religious traditions of kind of creation myths. And it is really a fascinating and an amazing experience from a literary point of view, and just as a fan as well, to really see these themes play out. So we are coming to the end of this first segment, and we will be back with Luke in a moment. Brilliant, we're back. Right, now, welcome back. And we've got more Lord of the Rings and Tolkien knowledge for you. You guys have been really treated today because you're used to just me talking along. So this is a treat for you. So enjoy it. And there are plans for more episodes with Luke as well. So you are going to be really spoiled, you guys. Don't say that I don't look after you. Anyway, we're back to Tolkien again. And Luke, talk to us about an important lecture that he gave in 1938.
Yeah. So in terms of what your podcast is all about, Aaron, it should be right up your street, because in terms of understanding some of that philosophy behind stories and why he wrote and why he specifically wrote fantasy, there's this fantastic lecture that Tolkien gave in 1938 on all this sort of stuff. But the lecture itself only became very well known in the 60s after his work had become more popular. I mean, the lecture itself he only gave just after The Hobbit had been published, so he wasn't that well known. But in the 60s, it was written down as an essay and expanded a bit that was called On Fairy Stories. And the original lecture Tolkien had been asked to do, I think at St Andrews University in Scotland, to commemorate Andrew Lang, who is a popular folklorist who's still pretty famous now. He put together a big book of fairy stories that were mainly targeted at children. And that was probably the best known example of fairy tales that we had at the time of Tolkien's writing.
Yeah.
And the time that he gives this lecture. But there's a problem in that Tolkien doesn't really agree with Lang. So he has to do this lecture to commemorate him. But he also, being the sort of personality he was, takes issue with some of the definitions that Lang set up. So,
wow.
Yeah. So Tolkien doesn't think that fairy stories should mainly be aimed at children. He's very anti that. He doesn't even think that fairy stories should really be about fairies as characters in particular. He famously really hated the kind of Victorian, sort of small, domesticated, in your back garden sort of fairies that were very popular at the start of the 20th century.
Yeah.
He was really into this much older idea of fairies and elves that comes from Old English and Scandinavian folklore, which he thought had kind of been perverted. And this comes back to his obsession with language. He found out that the word fairy was first used in English to describe a place. It was used to describe someone being of fairy, so looking like they had come from a place rather than being, a specific type of creature with wings or something that. So Tolkien spells fairy a bit funny. He spells it Faerie with a little umlaut with two dots over the A, and that's the word he uses to describe fairy as the place. So for Tolkien, fairy stories take place in the realm of fairy, this sort of created world that we talked about earlier. And there might be fairies as characters in there. Tolkien loves his elves, but they don't have to be. And he calls this created world the secondary world. So our reality that we live in, Erdington for me in North Birmingham in the UK,
yes,
that's the primary world. and Middle Earth, Numenor, Valinor, Arda, all of those places you hear about in Middle Earth and in his books, that's the secondary world. So if you hear us using those phrases from now on, that is what they mean.
Brilliant.
But in order for this fairy story to work, like we were saying earlier on, this second world has to feel real. It has to be consistent. It has to be believable. You might have heard of the phrase suspension of disbelief or
Yeah.
willing suspension of disbelief. Tolkien doesn't believe in any of that. He says, for a story to be good, you shouldn't have to suspend disbelief whilst reading it. You should be able to take it as real. And I think
Wow.
that's something that his stories sort of achieve really well. And it's a lovely affirmation of that childlike wonder where you can take those stories at face value. You don't feel the need to be cynical and to pick holes in everything. And it also points to Tolkien's incredible ability to create that consistency. For example, one of the things people always bring up is why don't they just use the big eagles that appear in Lord of the Rings to just fly over Mordor and drop the ring in the volcano?
I thought that as well.
Yeah, people say, especially people who have just watched the films. But if you read the Silmarillion and you read some of Tolkien's letters and that sort of thing, you will know that there are very important and consistent reasons throughout his stories that mean they can't just jump on the eagles and drop the ring in the volcano. But yeah, that's getting a bit more specific.
So this is quite interesting, and because there a lot of criticisms, and we're jumping just paralleling with Star Wars. I know there's a slight differences there, but there's a lot of issues with the new sequel trilogy because of that idea of them being very inconsistent within their own genre. And here we're talking about Tolkien showing how that is such an important factor to any piece of writing, is that the in-world logic is consistent. And I'm glad that you've picked up on that, Luke, and that the podcast audience can really get a sense of how important that is. That the in-world logic, there's rules to it. It's not ad hoc. The authors put a structure in place there, and it needs to be followed. So the Eagles, like you say, can't just pick up the ring or drop it into Mount Doom, because there's reasons why they can't do that. There's a congruent, logical reason, and the authors put that in place. It's law, but it's a bit of law, LORE, but it's also a bit of law, LAW, as well in that context. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that I found quite frustrating about the new Star Wars films, is that sense of things sort of contradicting, especially the character of Luke Skywalker just not really feeling consistent or believable to those original films. There's a specific scene where they use a spaceship going into hyperspace as a weapon, and loads of people have said if you could do that in the world, people would do it all the time. It's not consistent to sort of show that happening just once.
I remember that that was Last Jedi, wasn't it? It was in that just Last Jedi film, I think it was.
The Last Jedi film, yeah. I think there's fairly obvious reasons for why, particularly the new films, and to an extent the prequels as well, lacked some of that consistency.
Yeah.
Whereas Lord of the Rings doesn't. I mean, Tolkien is making this, it's a labor of love. He's taking years and years, and he's not making it to anyone's deadline. Like, he's making this, he loves it. I think there's a sense, I'm personally not into the whole jumping on the sequel films and bashing them in quite the same way the fan base does. I don't think they're a complete sort of cinematic disaster like people describe them and stuff, but but they're made to strict deadlines because Disney need to turn a profit, and I think one of the things that's most obvious about those films is that they didn't really think through a consistent storyline before starting them, particularly those most recent three, whereas Tolkien's planning this stuff and revising it and going over and over and over again so that it's consistent and he's happy with it. He's not perfect. There's some, if you really look closely, there's some inconsistencies in Lord of the Rings that don't quite make sense.
Yeah.
But on the whole, it's very good.
Yeah. So if any of you are listening to the podcast and you want to go into screenwriting, or you want to, kind of write it, you want to go into storytelling in terms of maybe as a job or career, or just even for your own satisfaction. Um, these are really important key points to pick up on. And like we've said, that sort of that in-world logic and trying to be as congruent and consistent to your own myth making as possible is very important in the process indeed. Moving ahead to now, just thinking about, the films really caught the imagination in an amazing way, and that that's how I personally came into the world of Tolkien. How did that impact you?
Yeah, I think films always have an ability to reach a much wider audience than an enormous book like Lord of the Rings does. I mean, it's a real doorstop, especially in one volume. Although I think it's actually very readable and very engaging, despite its size. I wouldn't want to put anyone off. I think it looks more intimidating than it actually is.
Yeah.
But yeah, the appeal of the books has rocketed since those films, and which is something I think sort of purists of the book who criticize those films need to remember, is like way more people have been able to read Lord of the Rings because of the exposure those films gave it. But Tolkien himself, sort of reflecting on the kind of unexpected success of his work, said, "It remains an unfailing delight to me to find my own belief justified, that the fairy story is really an adult genre and one for which a starving audience exists."
Wow.
And I think that really translates very strongly to the screen. The things that spark sort of wonder and joy in Tolkien's books are based in very elemental, universal things, in the narrative, in particularly the beauty of the language and the dialogue that Tolkien was a real master craftsman of.
Yeah.
And the Peter Jackson films largely stay faithful to some of the most powerful pieces of dialogue and some of the most powerful visual images, I think, in the film, with some exceptions. I think sort of Gandalf's words to Frodo of, so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given to us. That sort of thing that just really moves you on a deep level. They dealt with very well, I think, in the film.
Yes.
And a lot like the book, there weren't a whole lot of epic fantasy films that had been done well before Lord of the Rings. Think of sort of some of that Jim Henson stuff, like Willow and like Labyrinth with David Bowie.
Yeah.
Maybe the Never-Ending Story.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah.
Do you think of any other like fantasy films? Maybe The Princess Bride.
Well, I was a fan of the Never-Ending Story. I absolutely love both of those films, especially the first one, though.
I think I've only seen the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, the first one was a very good film. And I think of yeah. I think Star Wars would be in there as well.
What is that? Star Wars would be in there.
Probably.
Yeah, I think people often count Star Wars as a science fiction film, and I would say quite strongly that I think it's more of a fantasy film.
That's a controversial one, isn't it? Because I know that they talk about Star Wars in terms of it being very romantic or romanticized science fiction, but you're saying more on the fantasy side.
Yeah, we could get down a real tangent here, but I think for me, science fiction should be something like Blade Runner or Ex Machina, that deals with these sort of quite deep existential questions of, we've got this new technology, or society has progressed to a certain point, and how does that now affect us as human beings and our souls and that sort of thing in quite a deep level. And I don't think Star Wars I know it's got lasers and it's in space and stuff, but it's not really about those sorts of questions. It's about the sense of adventure and the sort of good versus evil kind of archetypes and redemption and those sorts of things. So yeah, I'd say it's closer to to fantasy than science fiction.
That's a good argument. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's, and for you podcast audience, I think like these are interesting ideas. You may agree with Luke, you may disagree with Luke, but there's certainly, I think Luke's made a good argument there, and there are certainly those factors to consider as well. So yeah, well played there, Luke.
So yeah, um, in terms of why Lord of the Rings was successful, I think it's similar to the book. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff aside from Star Wars, maybe, that was set in a completely secondary world, and that was what made many filmmakers deem the material unfilmable for so long. I think Stanley Kubrick was offered the opportunity to film Star Wars in the 60s.
Oh wow!
Just reckoned he couldn't do it. There's some animated Lord of the Rings films from the 70s, which Emily and I watched recently. One's by an animator called Ralph Bakshi. I don't know how they were received at the time, but having watched the Peter Jackson ones, they're not very good. So yeah, in terms of Peter Jackson turning up at a sort of certain point in history and being able to make those films with the technology that was then available to them, they managed to pull off a lot of that stuff fairly successfully. And particularly the first film for me, I think is lightning in a bottle. I don't think we'll ever see the like of that again. There's things I don't like about these films, but I think they are probably the best adaptation of Lord of the Rings that we're ever going to get. I think there's a lot of reasons to be very grateful. That said, I don't think Tolkien would have liked the films for no other reason than they require that suspension of disbelief that we were talking about earlier on.
Yeah.
Not often. I think that's how good they are. But Tolkien would view that as drama instead of literature. The world is no longer contained in words on a page and in your imagination. It's out there. Like Aragorn looks a certain way now. You've seen how they imagined that Minas Tirith would look, or the Shire would look.
Yeah.
And for Tolkien, that undermines what fairy's all about. Like there's something about literature that's essential to that. There's something about imagination that's really important. We could talk forever about just how much he flipping loves words and inventing his own words and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's this beautiful passage in On Fairy Stories essay, which we've barely talked about actually.
Yeah.
Where he says it was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of words and the wonder of things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. That's such a beautiful. He's good with words, man.
Yeah.
But especially that last pair there, the idea of all those things he ties up with bread and wine, which, given how Tolkien would have understood and revered the Eucharist and communion as a Catholic,
of course, yes,
incredibly weighty. Yeah.
Wow, very good. Why did he think those words were important, and what does he mean when he talks about the wonder of those quite ordinary and potentially boring things?
Or like stone and wood and trees and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think a big part of it is that, and this is where it gets almost a bit more theological, I think, is that he thought that a good secondary world could make things actually feel more real than in the primary world, or at least the one we're presented with, the very flat materialistic understanding of the world.
Yeah.
You do your wage labor job. You have this very utilitarian view of the world where everything is based on something's usefulness or something's value in a market, its monetary value and that sort of thing. Tolkien, living at a time where there was a global war that he lived through. We lived through both world wars. The industrialization of England, which is a big theme in his book. He sees a real importance in, I guess, returning a lot of this value to the primary world through the secondary world. Yeah. So If we take just one of those things, like trees in particular are such a big theme throughout Tolkien's work.
Yeah.
And he would say that you don't spoil a forest by having experienced an enchanted forest. You don't read Tolkien and then see trees and think, oh, they're a bit boring compared to Tolkien's trees in Middle Earth that can walk or that have these magical properties or whatever.
Yeah.
It works the other way around. It makes the trees you see in the primary world slightly magical themselves. That sort of enchantedness overflows. I can definitely speak to that, just having been in Sutton Park or walking around the Peak District, which is near where my sister lives. Once you've been to sort of Fangorn or Lothlorien or Ithilien or any of those, or Mirkwood, any of the forests in Tolkien, I don't think you're able to see trees and sort of the natural world in quite the same way again.
Yeah.
There's something really fascinating about that, I think.
Brilliant. So, as we're coming towards the end of our second segment now, you guys are really being treated on the show now, and we'll take a little moment now, and we'll be back with part 3 very, very soon. So we're back. So this has been an amazing time with Luke, and like I've said on the podcast show, there are plans afoot for more episodes with Luke, as we're going to explore mythos and story and powerful narratives. Moving forward now, I'm just thinking of ideas in terms of a lot of the things that we've spoke about. There's some escapism there. Especially you talked about Tolkien's kind of secondary world.
Yeah.
Isn't there a bit of a danger that you might become so invested in this world that it's kind of it's a situation where people are not going to be invested in the actual world?
Yeah, sure. I think that's something that I definitely is probably still a danger for me now is you get so invested and so interested in all the detail that that's just where you want to spend all your time. And definitely for me as a kid reading those books for the first time, and I have a little bit more of an obsessive personality as well. That's a real thing. And there's a lot of people who would have said that at the time, and my mum probably would have said that Tolkien and fantasy and Star Wars is this sort of escapist thing that's for children, and your focus should be on, you've got responsibilities in the primary world, and Tolkien wouldn't deny that, I don't think, but he also sees escapism as a positive thing. So in fairy stories, he uses this image of, well, if you're a prisoner in a cell, are you supposed to only think about being in prison and wardens and walls and your little window and your uncomfortable bed? And this is probably one of the richest parts of his philosophy, because that metaphor, that picture, suggests that there is something beyond the mundaneness and the material, and that's something that's almost universal. Like everyone recognizes that and kind of longs for that. It's the equivalent of the sunlight coming through the little window high up in your prison cell, or the smell of flowers, or the sound of trees beyond the prison. I think, again, that picture can be misread as well. I don't think Tolkien sees the primary world as something that is somehow a deception, or we've got to leave it entirely, like in the Matrix or something like that. I don't think it's a rallying call for suicide. I don't think it's possible to read that from his work at all, by any means. These primary and secondary worlds aren't entirely separate. They interact and almost overlap over each other. A little bit like we were describing earlier on about an enchanted tree doesn't ruin a primary world tree for you. It actually causes you to revere it and treat it as special in a way that, for me, I think is good. I think that's the thing that's most special about that kind of escapism, is that most of the things we learn and can see in Lord of the Rings point us to a better way of understanding and inhabiting the primary world.
Yeah.
So in terms of theology and spirituality and that sort of thing as well, I think these books are an excellent way of trying to understand better something of the unseen world beyond this material one, and how that unseen world is capable of interacting with us as human beings, and can transform us and point us to things that are good in a positive way.
Yeah.
Tolkien's probably not the primary way that I would do that, but I think
Okay.
I'm a Christian who's raised in the Protestant tradition,
Mm.
and in England as well, and a lot of that draws from a lot of those traditions of modernity, in terms of the way we see the world, just being sort of impacted by the Enlightenment and by utilitarianism and by a lot of that sort of thing, including the way we understand the Bible and understand faith and religion. And there's something about the way Tolkien writes that just helps me, I think, understand some of those stories and some of the narrative of the Bible in a more exciting and refreshing way.
Yes.
So Tolkien's use of imagery, I think, and symbolism is an enormous part of that. The way he depicts the natural world, the importance of especially the sea and trees, like we've already talked about. Those two things in particular are of enormous symbolic importance in Tolkien's world, as they are in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. The stars are another thing that's really important to Tolkien, and that are also really important to sort of first and second temple Judaism in the scripture. And there's a lovely mystery to Tolkien as well, which I think for some of us more sort of reformed modernist folk can be alien to us. It's all about, figuring out answers and being able to fix stuff. And there are things within Tolkien's own world that he deliberately didn't know about. The Ents, the famous sort of walking trees, the shepherds of the forest in the two they have these. They talk about the Ent wives, who are the female Ents who are their wives. That's just fairly obvious in the name. But there's a bit of this story where there's no more Ents anymore because they've lost the Ent wives, and it's deeply sad, but it's also a mystery in the story. And Tolkien himself, I think, says that there was nothing in his head in terms of resolving that in any of the stories that he wrote or plans to write. That was something that he deliberately, like Tolkien didn't know what happened to the Ent wives either, which I think is fascinating. That's so alien to me in terms of the level of detail and the level to which he had so much of this stuff figured out, that he sort of deliberately left some sort of loose ends in there. The other thing that's really distinctive about his work, and that people talk about a lot, is that it's not intended as an analogy. I think in the same way that particularly C.S. Lewis and Narnia and that sort of fantasy world is, especially The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Anyone who's familiar with that work will know that it's a fantasy story. I really enjoy it, but it's intended as this direct analogous. Right, it's not a spoiler to say that Aslan is the Christ figure. It's fairly obvious in the way that story works, and Tolkien's just not really interested in that. And for me personally, that's partly why I prefer his work. His work is not necessarily an argument for anything. There's definitely values in there that are really inherent to Tolkien's worldview, particularly his sort of English Catholicism. But he's not trying to make an argument for those in the story. I think he's trying to create something that he believes is true and that is beautiful, and that largely centers around the imagery and the narrative rather than trying to make analogies. He talked about something called applicability rather than analogy. He said he preferred that because it leaves it more on the reader than on the author. And that's partly what makes his work so appealing and widely appreciated as well. I think going back as well to some of that stuff we were talking about modernity, Tolkien himself is not a modernist at all. Like he is an old soul. His values are very pre-modern, almost medieval. I know we can use medieval is mostly used as a negative word to describe being very cruel or very brutal. I'm not so much talking about that. I mean a sort of pre-Renaissance, pre-Enlightenment kind of worldview. So Middle-earth doesn't exist to push those agendas that might come out of modernity and this idea of, you know, arguing your point and proving things and that sort of thing. He's trying to create something that is of high beauty and truth and consistency, and that moves you, which is something we'll I think we're going to talk about in the future as we move on to some different topics.
Brilliant. Well, that's been fascinating and amazing, Luke, to have you on today on your birthday as well, of all days.
I wouldn't rather be doing anything else, to be honest.
Brilliant. So we've covered a lot today, and like I say, like, you know, podcast universe, you have been spoilt today. You've got a lot of knowledge, and I hope that will bring, because it has for me as well, a newfound appreciation, even to a greater level, of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and this greater mythos, which we love to explore on the show. And so, like I said, we have got more episodes with Luke coming up, and this is a really, really exciting. We are going to be talking about an interesting concept, which is in a lot of books and films, and even in the Bible, called eucatastrophe. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Nailed it.
Brilliant. And that is going to be something that we're going to be talking about very, very soon. It's a great sort of trope that you see in a lot of in different genres, but you see how Tolkien really shows it vividly, and it's a really powerful trope. It's an archetypal sort of situation, really. Well, I'll let Luke explain that more on our next episode anyway. And we also are going to be looking at, like I talked about earlier, the mythos and the creation story of the Silmarillion. And I do also want to be talking with Luke as well about an episode on the wizards of Middle-earth as well. So for those of you who are really fans of Gandalf the Grey or Gandalf the White or Saruman, these episodes will really be standing out and really be something that you'll be looking for and really into as well. So, Luke, go and enjoy the rest of your birthday.
Yeah, will do.
And we'll catch up with you very, very soon.
Looking forward to it, man.
I know, and thank you for being on the show today as well.
Oh, my pleasure.
Talk to you soon.
See you, Aaron.
The Law Be With You podcast show is now available on Apple Podcasts. So if you have an iPhone or an iPad, and if you're an Apple user, you can download our show, subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Hopefully the comments will be positive, and I'm hoping that you're enjoying the show and the direction that we're going. Also, leave a suggestion, any law-based interesting ideas that you would love to see us cover on the show, science fiction, fantasy, and the like. We have got, as I said earlier, previously, there are more episodes of Luke Sewell coming up as well, so you really are being treated on the show. And yeah, look forward to the next episode with Luke, and I hope you are enjoying it. God bless you.